Well, good morning. Even though it's afternoon where I am right now, most people will be seeing this in the morning, and so good morning to you. And it's good to be back with you again. I know you have enjoyed the study on the Gospel of John with Dr. Ian Fair. He always brings great insight to the scriptures, and this past quarter has been another one of his excellent lessons. So thank you, Ian. I understand that if you do something for like 21 days in a row or 21 times, some activity, that it becomes a habit. Well, we've been into this quarantine now for almost, over 5 months. And I imagine if you're like me, maybe you have picked up some new habits that you actually didn't have. And one of the things that I'm interested in is, have you seen either in yourself or in maybe your family members, a spouse or kids or some friends, a new habit or some new information about that person that you just didn't know? But because of being quarantined and living in the conditions that we're living in, that this new trait came to the surface. A couple examples. One person told me, a lady told me, that she found out, even after being married for 50 years, that her husband had cheated on the driver's test when he was a teenager. Well, I watched them for a couple of times after that, and I don't think it really impacted their marriage. But I did notice that she seemed to cinch up a little bit tighter with a seatbelt when she would get in the car. And another friend of mine told me, he said, my wife and I, we're watching more television together. The other night chose the program that we were going to watch. And it was Pride and Prejudice. And if you know, that was a pretty long show. Well, my friend said, after it was over, she now owes me 4 Gunsmokes, 3 Mayberry RFDs, and 1 Swamp People. Now, folks, those kind of things are nothing more than Psalms 133, exactly what Psalms 133 is talking about. How blessed and how sweet and how pleasant and how good is it when brothers and sisters dwell together in unity. Well, that's exactly what is going on now with this virus. We're learning things about each other, and we're still dwelling with each other in peace and unity, we hope at least. So, if you have found something new in either yourself, preferably in yourself, or with somebody else, drop me a text or send me an email. I'd like to know what they are. And maybe I can incorporate it in a lesson somehow. And of course, we'll scrub it and leave your name completely out of it. Okay. We are about to embark on a journey of Proverbs. Most of them will be out of the book of Proverbs, but there will be a few others outside that, such as some from Ecclesiastes. And this is a very interesting book, and I hope to have some very enjoyable times and some times of learning as well. These are sayings that are intended to make us to be more productive, to be happier, to learn how to handle different situations. And so that is going to be the focus and the intent and the claim of our study in this quarter. Before we begin, let's have a prayer, would you? Dear Father, as always, we honor you as being the creator and the sustainer of life. You're wonderful, you're magnificent, and you're awesome, and yet you still are concerned with the individuals of us, even though we are of dust. Thank you for loving us the way you do. Father, we ask your blessings on not only this lesson, but on this world. We ask that you help us with our lives, that you give us insight, and may the lessons the coming weeks just do that to help us live a more productive life in your presence. Thank you for all that you do. Bless those who are struggling with issues in their life, health-wise, or situations in their life. Be with them. Help us always to honor you and to look for you in the daily things of our life. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, in chapter 1, chapter 10, and in chapter 25 are the words that these Proverbs were written by King Solomon. And in fact, chapter 25 makes this statement: "These are more Proverbs of Solomon, compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah." Now, there's something interesting about that, and that is that Hezekiah lived 200 years after Solomon. These are words and sayings that had been hanging around, that were available. Maybe they were written down, maybe they were common sayings, I don't know. But anyway, Hezekiah evidently commissioned some of his scribes, please compile some of the Proverbs of Solomon after 200 years. And so most of the things that are written in the book of Proverbs come from Solomon. However, there are a few others, a couple others specifically, that have the text attributed to them. For example, Proverbs 30 is said to be written by Agar, and Lemuel, King Lemuel, who we don't really know anything about, also wrote the famous chapter, Proverbs 31, which is the characteristics of a virtuous woman. Well, if you look closely at that chapter, the very first few verses of that say, well, King Lemuel got that from his mother. Now, anytime I see a text like that and says something like that, you know there was something behind the scenes going on that was actually more than what these few words say. And so my mind just kind of ran with a couple of options. Were the things written in Proverbs 31 just something that his mother had said over time, just different things, and he remembered them or had written them down? Or maybe even before he was king, what happens if he was about to marry somebody his mother didn't really approve of? Maybe she just said, it's time for you to start thinking straight, grabs him by the ear, sits him down with parchment and pen, and says, you need to write these things down. I have no idea what the setting was for chapter 31. But somewhere probably between those two bookends, something happened. Whatever it was, behind all of these Proverbs, there's probably some kind of situation, some kind of event that triggered the various thoughts. So, specifically, the Proverbs contained in the book of Proverbs are mostly from Solomon. In 1 Kings 4, it says that Solomon spoke over 3,000 Proverbs. Well, now the book of Proverbs has 915 verses, and that means if every one of them had been written by Solomon, that there were over twice that many more available or had been said at some point in time. And so Solomon was very, very prolific in his education and in the things that he wrote. It also says in this same chapter that Solomon wrote over 1,000 songs. Well, in the book Solomon's Song or Song of Song, depending upon how your Bible has identified that chapter, there's 117 verses there. Well, that means if each one of those verses was considered a song, there was over 9 times those kinds of verses that Solomon wrote. And so Solomon was very, very prolific. Now, this next point, and my quality control expert has suggested, now Garth, don't spend a lot of time on that point. And I don't want to do that, but I want you to consider something. What is the difference between a writer and an author? Well, if you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find that sometimes the words are kind of interchanged, and a writer can be an author, and an author can be a writer, and so forth. Well, for our discussion today, I'd like to draw a little bit of a distinction between the two. I would like for you to think of a writer as more like a scribe, somebody who takes the information from somebody else and composes it and writes it down. Whereas an author is somebody who thinks it up for the first time. And maybe that distinction is a little too much, but for the sake of discussion, look at this, would you? In Proverbs, the 4th chapter, Solomon writes, "For I too was a son to my father, still tender," and of course his father was David, "still tender and cherished by my mother. Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart, keep my commandments, and you will live." Now, when you read that, it makes you think that some of Solomon's wisdom must have come from David, from the things that David had taught him while he was young and still under the care of Bathsheba, his mother. And it says in verse 4, "Then he taught me, and he said to me, take hold of my words with all your heart." And so there was some education of Solomon that came actually from David. And along that same line, the information that didn't come from David, look at this verse, also in that same chapter, in 1 Kings. "God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore." So even Solomon, when he would come up with an idea, it wasn't because he was the author of that idea. It had been given to him by God. So let me suggest that the Proverbs and the things, not only of this book, but of the whole Bible, the things that are from God actually are from God. Now, this brings me to a point that I want to make an application for us today. And it's a verse that is found in 1 Corinthians 4, and I know you've heard me say this before, but I think it's worth remembering. And that is, what do you have that wasn't given you? You know, sometimes when we accomplish and complete something that we think is pretty good, pretty grandeur maybe in the eyes of yourself and other people, if you really are honest and you stop and you think about it and you look back, so many times we have very little to do with it. Look at these verses. In Acts 17, it says that he determines the bounds of your habitation. Now, nobody asked me, did you want to be born in Wheeler, Texas? Nobody asked that. You know, if they had, I would have said, well, yeah, sure, that's the obvious thing. But turns out it was not done. I did not get the choice of doing that. It was just given to me. And each of our situations and each of your situations are exactly the same thing. The time that we made our appearance on the stage of this earth was determined by somebody else. We had very little to do with it. That same chapter says this, that God gives life and breath. We didn't have anything to do with it. It was given to us, and we enjoy it, and we use it, but it came from somebody else. Back to the first statement, what do you have that wasn't given you? Moses wrote in Deuteronomy 8 that God gives us power to make wealth. And so while we think we are very good in playing the stock market or doing inventions or doing this or doing that, and it turns out pretty good, it's really God giving us the power to do those kinds of things. He told Jeremiah, "Oh, the plans I have for you." And so if you look back at all of those things, you find out that there were really a lot of pieces to the puzzle of your life. And the few things that we think that we've accomplished, if you're really honest, we come back to 1 Corinthians 4. What do you have that wasn't given you? We have been primarily more of a conduit than an entity. Turns out I have a friend in Austin, known him for a long time, worked with him for years, and he has more patents than anybody that I've ever known. Turns out, if you walked into his office toward the end of his career, up at the very top next to the ceiling was a plaque. And this plaque talked about the patents that came and were granted to him. And under each one of them, there was about a 1.5-inch bar that identified his specific patents. Well, it started at the ceiling, went down to the floor, and on the floor it was rolled up that if it had been rolled out, it would have gone across the room. More patents. Well, if you'd asked my friend, boy, you're really smart, he would tell you there were a lot of people involved. There were so many people involved. And the technology had to be right. He was born, given an engineering mind. He was educated a certain way. He had opportunities on projects. The technology and the market had to exist. The company had to support him. All of these things. And he said, I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. What do we have that wasn't given us? I think Solomon would say the same thing as well. In 1 Kings 4, it says, Now God gave Solomon wisdom and a very great discernment and a breadth of mind like the sand that's on the seashore. Continuing on, it says, he spoke of trees. He spoke also of animals and birds and creeping things and fish. Men came from all peoples to hear the wisdom of Solomon, men and women like the Queen of Sheba, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his great wisdom. He was an anthropologist. He was all the ologists that we know of. And he had the ability to learn these things. Now, it turns out when we learn something, it's usually because we've experienced it. Here, the information that God gives him, he was able to talk about these things without having to experience all of them himself. So what is a proverb? Well, if we look at the next few verses in chapter 1, verses 2 through about 6, I guess, we'll find out that a proverb is a very short saying that's in frequent and widespread use that expresses a basic truth or practical precept. Now, that's a current Webster definition. A short saying in frequent and widespread use that says that it is relative to the current time and expresses a basic truth or a practical precept. That says it's something that's useful. It's relative and it's useful. I know the things that I seem to have learned falls under this category, and that is what was learned by doing it wrong many times. Solomon knew what to say even without having to do it wrong many times. A proverb includes sometimes what to do. Sometimes it talks about how to do it. Maybe even the reason to do it. And everything is often in a very short, maybe just one sentence, captured in one sentence, a very short sentence. Here's some sayings by Benjamin Franklin, and that is, love your enemies, for they will tell you your faults. He that falls in love with himself will have no rivals. There's never a good war or a bad peace. And he that lies down with dogs shall rise up with fleas. Those are kinds of things that people come up with. Benjamin Franklin did these. Here's a carpenter's proverb, and it's in symbols. Can you figure out what it is? Okay, Travis, this is your first question for this quarter. A carpenter's proverb, and that is to measure twice and cut once. Travis is always sharp with these things. Turns out I read that there's a Bulgarian proverb about this same thing. It says measure 3 times and cut once. Well, they have much the similar idea and attitude. Russia takes it even farther. It says measure 1,000 times before you cut. Well, it seems to me if you spend your time measuring 1,000 times, you never get around to the cutting. My wife would finally say, that's all right, Garth, I didn't need it anyway. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit before we get more into the lesson about a caution. And that is, a proverb is a nugget of truth in a very short saying. Often there is no context around it. And you can't determine the total picture or the total scene just by looking at one piece. You can't create a total theology just by looking at one particular verse. And sometimes people have tended to do that with these various proverbs. Now let me see if I can illustrate that. I want you to work with me on this, okay? And that is, do you like puzzles? Especially around holiday times and Christmas time, Thanksgiving places, and times like that. Well, out come the puzzles. I heard of one of my friends saying that they were so bored they went out and bought a puzzle, and it was so complicated it was for 5-year-olds. Well, turns out sometimes that's what quarantine will do to you, something like that. Do you realize that the most important part, the most important piece of an entire puzzle is the picture on the front of the box? Because that one thing you refer to many times. What would happen if you were given a puzzle without a picture? You had all these pieces, and you pick up the first piece, and this is what it looked like. And you say, well, this is a picture of a young kid, tow-haired kind of kid, and he's smiling, so the situation must be a fun thing. We know he'll have arms, he'll have legs, and things like that. And so you start putting the puzzle together. And it's like if you take one proverb out of the book of Proverbs and start to build an entire theological position around that one verse and saying, okay, this is it. An example of that is Proverbs 22 that says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. If you've ever been in a discussion group talking about that particular verse, invariably it will come up to the point, well, I'm not sure that verse is absolutely true because I've got a couple of kids and I raised them both exactly the same way, and one turned out one way and one turned out another. And so I'm not sure that verse is 100% true. And so we wrestle with trying to make a particular verse the total theological picture. Well, it's like taking this picture of a young boy, one piece of the puzzle, and you start putting it together without the big picture, without knowing the big picture. And when you get through, you say, I was right, and there you have it. But you say, no, it still doesn't fit because this was the puzzle. And so while you had one piece, and it was very definitely a very significant piece to the puzzle, it fit in a different way than you thought. So we have to be careful as we look at the book of Proverbs and to understand that there is a nugget of truth. Let's not miss that, but we have to, again, look at the total context of the big picture, even though it's not listed in the verses before or the verses after. Okay? All right, moving on. Okay, here's verse 2 through 6. Purpose of the Proverbs: for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, in doing what is right. Notice this, verse 3, receive instruction and for doing what is right. So it's for education and for application. For giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and learn and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and the riddles of the wise. The bottom line for all of this is that Proverbs are supposed to be useful for daily life. Here are some Proverbs from around the world, and I want to make a point with these. Here's one from Kenya. It says, a man who uses force is afraid of reasoning. A Spanish proverb, whoever gossips to you will gossip about you. From Thailand, and I love this, when elephants fight, it's the ants that take a beating. Now we know that that's true. We've seen that in arguments among the management of a company. We have seen that in the struggles of an eldership in a church. And we've seen that in homes where the parents are struggling with each other. And it's always the congregation, the employees, or the children that are ones that take a beating. The heart that loves is always young. That's a Greek proverb. And shared joy is a double joy, but shared sorrow is half a sorrow. That's from Sweden. So I asked myself as I looked at these proverbs, and turns out there's several websites that have proverbs associated with different countries. Many countries. I won't say that I did an exhaustive search, but I did enough that I was exhausted. And so I looked at all these, and I had one question that was going through my mind, and that is this. How are Bible proverbs different from those of the world? And I looked, and I looked, and I looked, and I came up with one conclusion. There's one main difference, and that is the foundation of the Proverbs. And it's this. And it's the very first proverb in the book of Proverbs. The first verse says they come from Solomon. 2 through 6 tells you what they are and how they're to be used. And then it gives you the very first proverb, and it is this. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I looked through many proverbs. There were a lot of wise sayings from all around the world. I never found anything close to that statement. And here this is the number one, the very first proverb that's given. And this word fear, in the Bible, we read that, and the first thing often that comes to our mind is being scared and that aspect. This is really a deep respect and a very deep and heartfelt reverence. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Notice this proverb. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praises endure forever. Guess where that's found? You have any idea? It's Psalms 111. And who wrote Psalms? David, Solomon's father. Solomon, when he would learn from David, no telling how many times he heard this whole point, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, to the extent that Solomon placed it number one in his whole list of all the Proverbs that he wrote that we have recorded. That says if you're looking for knowledge, if you're looking for relationships, if you're looking for situations and how to get out of them or how to deal with them, or if you're looking for theories, or if you're looking for just the decisions of life, that if you want to find the best solution to that, this is where you start. You start with your reverence and your fear and your attitude all toward the Lord. The founding fathers of our country knew this. Look at these statements. George Washington said, "Religion and morality are the essential pillars of a society." John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious group." And somebody that maybe you didn't know, but you know of him, Governor, and it turns out that was his first name. It wasn't a position, that was what they called him. Governor Morris said, "The religion is the only solid base of morals and the only solid base of free government." And there are others. I chose these particular three. It turns out they were the ones who formed the backbone and the structure of this great country that we live in. Turns out Governor Morris is the one who wrote the preamble to the Constitution. And I read that he made more speeches to the assembly as they were working and dealing with how to put this Constitution together. He made 173 speeches. So he was very, very involved, as these were. Now, we're coming to the close of our lesson here. And that is, in Arizona, about the last 7 or 8 years that we were there, we moved out to Anthem, Arizona, which is just north of Phoenix, and we were part of a church plant. And because we didn't have a building at that time, we met in a school. Now, schools in Arizona are much like the ones all over the United States, and that is rules like you can't pray in school, no religion, can't talk about Bible things, you can't have a prayer at the flagpole, even though one of the daughters of a very good friend of mine, she said, let's have a prayer at the flagpole to some of her students. She was called on the carpet, but she won. But that was the general feel. Let's just leave Christianity, let's leave the Bible, let's leave God out of it. But if you get to thinking, and the educators, they get to thinking, there has to be some kind of moral underpinning. There has to be some kind of foundation that goes beyond just the books and the learning of this world. And so as we would walk in on Sunday morning, going to class and worship in this school, on the wall, on this stucco wall, right as you would walk by, there were 6 pillars that were painted right on the wall. And they were labeled above them character traits. And here's what they were. There was caring, there was fairness, there was respect, there was responsibility, there was citizenship, and there was trustworthiness. Almost sounds like the fruit of the Spirit, doesn't it? Teachers and educators know that there has to be some kind of a foundation for the quality of life for it to exist in the way that it should. There are people who come to America who want the freedoms that exist here. Those freedoms exist only because of the one who gave us those freedoms. We start leaving him out, then the freedoms begin to ebb away. And we see even with our country today, you take God out of the picture and what happens? How's it working out for us? Each year we have more and more troubles. So, in our summary for our lesson today is this. Very simply, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs 1:7. Jesus said it this way, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. So the first 2 chapters of Proverbs teach us valuable lessons. No matter how hard one may try, an understanding of life and its situation begins with a deep reverence and a deep worship for the Creator. This will lead to wisdom, and this wisdom is the humility to understand that God is God and we are not. And so, bottom line, let's make God our first priority, because knowing the Creator of this world then enables us to know the creation even better. Well, that's the beginning of our lesson today, and we will delve then next week into Solomon's search for this wisdom, and we'll look a little more in depth in that. And so for your homework, it's in 1 Kings, the first 11 chapters. So remember Kings, 1 Kings 1, 1, 1. 1 Kings, first chapter, first 11 chapters. There you go. So that's what your assignment is for next week, with the idea of Solomon searching for wisdom. May you have a blessed week. Thank you for joining us today, and may the good Lord bless you.